Okay, hi everyone, welcome to week 8. It's not week 9, ignore that. We're not quite there yet. Next week, of course, is the semester break, so don't forget to take a break and holiday. No, everyone's got assignments, so yeah, that's all right, I understand. Including assignment for this subject, of course. It was just pointed out to me that or reminded that the unit guide says that the due date for the assignment 1 is week 8. Go by the assignment spec. So the assignment spec says week 9, we'll go with week 9. I must have had a reason for making it week 9 when I wrote the assignment spec, so we'll stick with that. So yeah, the assignment number 1 is due not next week because that's the break, but week 9. Has anyone got any questions about the assignment? Come on, guys! I know some people have started it because there's been a few questions on the discussion forum, which is good. So keep those questions coming through. Next week, whilst I'll be working, I won't actually be here at Caulfield. I'm going to be away for a writing retreat, so I'll be off writing papers and things like that. I'll check email moderately often, but the internet connection's not the best where I'll be. So if you can get your questions in this week rather than next week, that's probably a good thing to do. But I will be checking the discussion forums and email from time to time. Just won't be quite as frequent as I will be this week. Okay, so let's kick off the lecture for week 8. This week we're moving very much now into the organisational side of data warehousing. So we've spent the first couple of weeks setting up the argument about why data warehouses are different to other kinds of transaction processing systems. Then we spent some time looking at modelling and addressing some of the technical issues around particularly logical and physical modelling. And last week we looked at the idea of technical architectures, and Steve came and talked to us about the ETL process, extract, transform and load. We saw that not all loading processes are ETL, sometimes they're ELT, sometimes they're something completely different, sometimes they're real-time, sometimes they're not. So just, I guess, adding to the picture that there's no one way to do data warehousing. And one of the reasons why there's no one way to do that is that the organisational issues around deploying a data warehouse tend to be the bigger problem than the technical issues. It's developing a data warehouse, deploying it. Whilst there are certain engineering aspects to it, it's not an engineering problem really. The real hassles that we face tend to be organisational problems, organisational resistance, and aligning a data warehousing approach with the organisational culture, the organisational approach to decision making. Keeping in mind, of course, that a data warehouse is pointless unless we're actually improving decision making. That's our ultimate goal. So this week we're delving into those organisational issues. We've gone past methodologies and so on. Now we're looking at issues to do with, I guess the term is information politics, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. So we're going to cover two things. First of all, those organisational issues related to how information is used in an organisation and how that relates to power structures in an organisation. Data warehousing directly affects those. So we'll have a look at that. And then we'll finish up by looking at a few case studies of data warehouses and looking at what worked, what didn't work, and just get a feel for how different some of the projects can be from one to another. There really is no one-size-fits-all approach to deploying a data warehouse. So I guess that's the key lesson from this week's material. So first of all, let's look at this issue of information politics. Now, this seems like a fairly odd topic to address in an information technology unit. But of course, by now you've got the idea that we're not so much just about the technology, we're about making sure that the technology is used in the right way and understanding how organisational issues affect the technology deployment. It's getting close to 20 years now, or 20 years ago, Davenport and a couple of other authors wrote a book called Information Politics. Has everyone heard of Davenport, management theorist? Writes very popular management books, some better than others. This book that Davenport wrote was talking about how information flows through an organisation and how people particularly in managerial roles, derive their organisational mandate or their organisational authority based on the information that they can provide to other people in the organisation. In other words, it's moved more and more towards organisations that no longer manufacture things. It's the nature of industries, particularly in Western countries, has moved from actually building things, putting things together and making products, to actually managing that process, possibly offshore, but working with knowledge and information, perhaps from a marketing perspective, managing a brand, managing a relationship with customers, or from a sort of leadership perspective, coming up with organisational strategies and better ways to, I guess, ultimately make money. So more and more people are dealing with intangible things. The value that they provide to an organisation is not their ability to, I don't know, put together a computer case that is often outsourced to another company, but the ability to come up with a design for a computer case, or the ability to market a particular product, those kinds of things. So information plays obviously a key role in that. People's value to an organisation is dependent upon the information that they control and they provide to the organisation. So that means that when you start to play around with those information flows, those information structures, the way people interact with information, the way people get their information, you're not just providing information to people, you're directly, in some cases, directly threatening the value that some people provide to the organisation. So this kind of utopian vision that a lot of vendors have around data warehousing, this idea that you build a data warehouse and all of a sudden you open up access to information that people didn't have access to before. Very often the reason they didn't have access to that before was because they had to rely on other people to provide it to them. So this vision directly threatens the power that some people have in an organisation, and that can often lead to organisational resistance. It can often lead to also situations where people are consuming information without the analysis or interpretation that used to be applied to that information before. In some cases that can be a good thing, but in other cases it means that people are using information in an uninformed kind of way too. So you've got to keep those things in mind. Anyway, so Davenport, Prusak and Eccles wrote their book back in 1992, and it's become an important theme, not just for management, but for IT as well, particularly providing IT for management support. So let's have a look at what they came up with. Their book outlines a number of different models of information cultures in organisations. In other words, how organisations deal with information, and what we'll do today is draw some conclusions from that framework. Davenport didn't talk about data warehousing at all, but draw some conclusions from that and perhaps map that onto some of the material we looked at last week. So thinking about the scale and architecture of data warehousing and what we can learn from that. Okay, so the Davenport book is based on this idea, as I said, of organisations becoming more and more oriented towards working with information rather than physical, tangible products that actually get made. Obviously, at some stage, a physical product often has to be produced, but organisations, as I said, particularly in Western countries, tend to focus more on the services and the management of information to derive value. And because people's jobs and the actions that they perform in an organisation very much are defined by the information they can provide, the interpretation, the analysis, the access to information, information becomes a power source, a source of political power in an organisation. And when you have a situation where people view themselves as the gatekeepers to information and they derive their value to an organisation from that gatekeeper role, you start to see situations where people become resistant to sharing information. A more open information culture is anathema to that idea of, well, I control the information, and if you need that information, you've got to come see me. If you can get it from a business intelligence report, then what's my point for being in the organisation? Now, the organisation may very well say, well, exactly, what is the point? So that can be quite a threat. So we tend to see people's behaviour in organisations, not in every case, but in many cases, influenced by the information that they control, and their actions, whilst from a kind of objective engineering kind of viewpoint of, well, surely open access to information is in and of itself a good thing. The more people who can access information, the more innovation, the better the decision making in the organisation. These are good things, and often the behaviours people have around the control of information is seen as irrational. But of course, from the individual's perspective, it's not irrational. They're simply defending their position in the organisation. So Davenport's argument in the book is to say, look, whilst there are certain information cultures or types of information cultures in organisations that are certainly unhealthy, that's being viewed from almost an external perspective or an organisational-wide perspective. But you've got to understand that people act as individuals from their individual perspective. So if you're going to fix an information culture, you have to do so by understanding those individual perspectives and understand why people resist that change. So political behaviour is often regarded as irrational or inappropriate, but you need to keep in mind that from the individual's perspective, it's often not. So one of the things with power or organisational power is that there's different kinds of power in an organisation. And there's quite a bit of work that was done in the management literature, particularly in the 1970s, looking at political power in organisations. Management theory's kind of moved on a little bit. But one useful way of looking at sort of organisational power is the idea of the value that people provide to the organisation in terms of whether or not they're replaceable or not. And if you think about data warehouses are a technology designed to reach into lots of different areas of an organisation. So particularly if you look at, say, an enterprise data warehouse approach, the mindset is, well, we need to source data from all the different business units in the organisation, and the reason we want to do that is so that we can get a cross-organisational view and support decision-making that incorporates information from lots of different places. That therefore directly threatens the power base that a lot of people have, because organisational power is often based on situations where people find themselves as irreplaceable. So, for example, maybe a particular manager is the only person who knows how a particular system or process works in an organisation, and if they're to be fired or moved on, then the organisation would really struggle to recover from that. So the idea of low substitutability, gathering information from lots of different places, kind of that classic gatekeeper role is often associated with strong levels of organisational power. And when you try to break down those gatekeeper roles with technology, it's not too surprising to see that those gatekeepers fight back because they are directly threatened by that technology. So Davenport's book, as I said, comes up with a framework of different information cultures in organisations. And this is actually a structure that you'll come across again when we start talking about governance. And in fact, you'll come across it in 5094, or for those of you doing David Arnott's unit, looking at DSS governance as well. So what they did was they looked at lots of different organisations and said, well, what are the different kinds of information cultures that are out there? And they came up with 5 different models, really actually 4 different models, but with one extra one that's kind of a naive solution to some of the other problematic information cultures. So that 5th one is actually the first one I've got listed here, technocratic utopianism. I love saying that. It just rolls off the tongue, technocratic utopianism. So many syllables. I apologise if English isn't your first language. That's a terrible phrase, but Davenport chose it, so we'll stick with it. I'll explain what it means in a second, but perhaps I should talk first of all about the other 4. So I'm going to skip over this slide and go straight to anarchy. Anarchy is the information culture in an organisation where there really is no prevailing model as such. Everyone kind of works for themselves to gather their information. So if a particular manager needs data for a particular report, they'll go out and get it themselves. They won't go perhaps through the IT department to build a BI tool or a reporting system. They'll simply throw together an Excel spreadsheet themselves, they'll get the data, they'll slice and dice it, do the analysis themselves and sort themselves out. And that kind of works in the short term. The problems tend to crop up in the longer term to do with the quality of analyses. If people are collecting data from all sorts of different places, then that analysis which might be useful to the organisation down the track, is often thrown away when the spreadsheet's thrown away. So you put together your Excel spreadsheet, you do your analysis, you answer your question, and even though that data and that analysis might be useful to other people, you perhaps delete it because you don't need it anymore. So there's no kind of centralised management or reuse of that data gathering and that data analysis. There was also another issue in my head that just popped out as I was talking about that one. Monday morning, it seems I can only hold one thing in my head at a time. So the problems are long term. Oh, the other thing. We often see situations where these kinds of ad hoc data analysis or decision support approaches start to become mission critical. So people start to rely on the data to do their job. And if they've thrown the data together, perhaps very often using an Excel spreadsheet, the kind of underpinning engineering principles are not necessarily particularly sound. There may be no backup procedures. No one really understands how the tool and the dependencies of the tool actually work. So how does the ETL process work? So there's no kind of centralised management of that infrastructure, which, if it becomes mission critical and breaks, very often the IT department get the blame for it, even though they didn't build it. So that becomes a real problem and becomes a strong argument for a centralised kind of approach where the IT department manages this kind of analysis. But that, of course, raises its own problems, which you'll talk about in 5094. So whilst this kind of ad hoc or informal kind of approach to an information culture can provide pretty good information support or decision support to individuals, there's no kind of organisational strategic approach where you can reuse or centrally manage the kinds of analysis that get performed. So as I said, problems tend to crop up in the longer term. So that's kind of the first category or style of information culture. The second one that they identified, they called feudalism. And this tends to be, well, they argue that it's the most common. I reckon it's actually, on paper it's the most common, but in reality what happens on the ground is more anarchic than feudal. They called it feudal because they said they see it as similar to the kind of medieval feudal system of government in places like Western Europe and so on, where you've got sort of a chief or some kind of aristocrat who governs a particular region, but they're governed in turn by another sort of more senior noble person and so on, until eventually you get to the king who governs the entire land. But there's a certain level of autonomy for each of those different groupings right down at the bottom of the hierarchy. So the laws in one part of the land might be very different to the laws in the other part of the land, kind of thing. And this is what they argued often happens in organisations. There may be some efforts towards managing information resources, to coming up with policies on things like data quality and backup and recovery and those kinds of things. There may be strategic approaches to even things like knowledge management or information management in individual business units, but there's no coherent strategy or coherent culture across the entire organisation. So this is where you tend to see those gatekeeper roles cropping up. So there might be one or two people who have a significant amount of knowledge about one particular business unit area, and if you want to get information about that business area, you have to go through them to get that information. So most of the information is managed by, say, heads of units or individuals within particular business units. And there may be centralised sort of collection, interpretation, formatting, language, the kind of policies about information, but there tends to be on the ground, the control, the power itself tends to reside in the individual business units. So this tends to crop up particularly when you have a very decentralised organisation. So the sort of corporate governance, when it's very decentralised, kind of encourages an information governance structure that's decentralised as well. So that tends to work pretty well for the individual business units, and becomes a real problem though if you want to have a more enterprise style approach, because whilst with the anarchic approach where there's no coherent culture across the board, you can argue a mandate at the central level to say, okay, well, across the organisation we're going to fix this problem. We can't have this chaotic approach to information management. We're going to try to manage our information in a more rational, more managed kind of way right across the enterprise. When you've got this feudal structure in place, the power structures become much more solidified and much more concrete. They become harder to overcome. So when you've got the anarchic approach, the power's devolved, it's hyper decentralised. Overcoming those sort of individual power structures is a lot easier than overcoming these little, maybe I'll use the word cabals, of information control that reside within the different business units. They're more organisationally powerful, and they're more able to mount a unified resistance, if you like, to the enterprise. One of the things that the centralised, or the head office often tries to do to overcome the problems associated with this kind of feudalistic approach is to employ technocratic or technological utopianism, which often fails. And I'll perhaps at this point go back and talk about what that is. So technocratic utopianism is this idea that Davenport latched onto when he looked at a few organisations that were trying to resolve their information cultural problems. And often they were trying to do it through the use of technology. So deploy technology like a data warehouse, and the assumption was that that will solve the access problems that people had. But the common theme across the approaches was they were all failing. So this kind of technocentric approach to trying to solve what is very much a sociological or humanistic problem of information power and information control was assumed to be a problem of access rather than a problem of power and power management. Whilst the technocratic approach often saw the deployment of data warehouses, we often saw, as a result, a high failure rate of data warehousing projects because they were solving the wrong problem. Or rather, they were using the wrong tool to solve the problem. They were trying to use a technology tool when really it's a management or sociological problem that needs to be solved. So often the technology was deployed in a way which only the IT department really understood because it was a technical kind of engineering approach. Often these approaches were based upon an enterprise data warehousing approach, kind of a one-size-fits-all. We'll hammer people into using the data warehouse, and if they don't get the data that they need out of the data warehouse, well, too bad. And assumes that the organisation wants to encourage a culture where there's free flow of information. So the ETL process just keeps working and that information keeps getting churned out at the other end through the delivery systems, and you have this kind of utopian vision of information sharing. The problem with the idea of utopias is that they don't work in reality. They're unrealistic in their kind of vision, and that's certainly true of this kind of technocratic view. Sure, technology can play a part, but any approach that sees technology as the solution, whilst ignoring the realities of how people interact with each other, the relationships that are built around information control and information sharing, is going to face a real problem in trying to succeed. So as I said, this kind of approach was often deployed to try to break down the information hoarding or the gatekeeper situations that you get with the anarchic or the feudalistic kind of models or cultures that Davenport identified. But this great quote in the book from one of the managers in one of the organisations they went and did a case study on. There's been no technology that's been invented to convince unwilling managers to store information or even use that information that's being stored. So sure, you can build a data warehouse, but you can't force people to put data into the data warehouse, and you can't force people to use data that's in the data warehouse. People will find a way around it. So technocratic utopianism very often doesn't work. So it's related, yes, but not in a direct causal. It's not. They're not really talking about organisational structures, but an organisation that's got a culture of very decentralised, has a very decentralised structure, and maybe a very decentralised corporate governance approach. So devolving a lot of the power to business units rather than a centralised kind of approach. We'll often see the sort of feudal information cultures spring up. Because the information politics is, it's related to, it's influenced by the overriding corporate culture, if you like. So a very centralised corporate culture will tend to see a more centralised approach to an information culture as well. So it's related, but it's not, you know, you can have mix and match. You can sometimes see a very centralised organisational culture, but a very decentralised information culture, depending on...
Isn't that related to the structure of IT department in the organization?
No. No. Except that the structure of the IT department may be come about as a result of the overriding corporate cultural structure, corporate governance structure. So, again, if you've got a corporate environment where there's a very decentralised approach to management, then you're more likely to find decentralised IT departments rather than one single centralised IT department. Some organisations swing from one to the other as well. So here at Monash, culturally and historically, we've had a very decentralised culture because as a university we amalgamated with lots of other universities in the 1990s. So the Frankston campus, the Caulfield campus here, the pharmacy campus in Parkville and so on, were all separate universities and Monash acquired them. And so for a very long time in the 1990s we had this very decentralised culture, and we actually had very decentralised IT departments too. So there was at one time an IT department just for the Caulfield School of IT. We don't have that anymore. We've got a centralised IT department for the faculty, and that at the moment is going through the process of being devolved back to a centralised IT department. So the faculty IT department is now shrinking and becoming smaller, and the centralised hub is growing bigger. So organisations change, but you can't say decentralised IT department, therefore a feudalistic information culture. It's not that kind of thing. The information culture is an organic thing that comes about as a result of an overriding organisational culture. But the relationship is not a perfect causal relationship.
What's different between anarchy and feudalism? Because anarchy is also help individual, and feudalism is also individual.
No, it's more group based. So the feudal idea is that there's business units, organisational units that manage the information culture. So you might have one information culture. Say if we take Monash as an example, you might have an information culture in the Faculty of IT. It's quite different to an information culture in, say, the Faculty of Education or the Faculty of Business and Economics. What we actually have now at Monash is a push to centralise things organisationally from a management perspective, and we're starting to see common information requirements being applied across the faculties. So we're now moving to a less feudal kind of structure than we used to have from an information cultural perspective. But anarchy is not about... Anarchy and feudalism are different. Anarchy is very much... There's no prevailing culture anywhere. So even in an organisational unit, people just fend for themselves, they manage their own information. There's a purely organic kind of approach to an information culture. Whereas the feudal structure is the information culture adheres around the organisational units. Yeah. So it's more group-based. There's more rigorous approaches to information governance, like ensuring that the information is reliable, there's a reasonable level of quality, there's consistency across, for example, definitions of terms used in different systems and things like that. But the power is located in the organisational unit rather than people just being left to fend for themselves as you get with the anarchic approach. And what we're going to talk about here with the monarchic approach is the idea of centralising things from the organisational unit to the enterprise.
And who is individual?
Sorry, who's
Who is individual?
the who?
Individual, because it said that individual fends for themselves.
Who is the individual? The individual is a person. Yeah.
So it means that they can create an application and they can develop the software for their own.
Remember, we're not talking about software, we're talking about information culture. Yeah. So it might include software, but the Davenport is not writing about IT. He's writing about organisational theory, management theory. The term theory is perhaps too strong a term to apply to Davenport. Sorry, I shouldn't say that while I'm recording things and making it publicly available. Davenport is not an IT person. It's about management and organisational culture. So what we're talking about here is information culture. And whilst, sure, IT is affected by that and needs to integrate with an information culture, it's not about technology, it's not about software, it's about how people approach managing information, using information to do their job, and deriving their sort of organisational power from the information they have access to and the information they control. And whilst technology is sometimes used as a tool to try and solve the kind of information cultural problems, particularly with feudalism or anarchic kind of information cultures, a technocratic approach, like you get with technocratic utopianism, this idea that technology is going to solve our problems, is incredibly naive. It just doesn't work. If it works, it's because you got lucky, not because of any sort of rigorous planning.
Do we also know about the moral affection and the way to develop data warehouse?
Well, I'm going to get to that. So we'll talk about particularly the technical architectures that we talked about last week. So remember we talked about enterprise data warehouses versus data mart type approaches. And the underlying philosophy or reasons why you would choose one over the other dovetail with the kinds of information cultures you have in an organisation. So I'll finish talking about this model and then we'll get to the data warehousing side of things. Okay, so far we've got the anarchic approach, which is the absence of any kind of coherent approach to managing information or information culture. The feudal approach, where the power that people derive from the information culture resides in the organisational units. And the problems with those kind of decentralised approaches is that there's no one coherent approach to information management, and you tend to get these information silos in organisations. So information gets stuck in those business units, those organisational units, and it becomes really hard for the central decision makers, the C-level executives and so on, who are trying to get a cross-organisational view to be able to make strategic decisions about where the organisation should go. It becomes harder for them to get access to the information. So one approach is to solve that problem by deploying technology, and it doesn't work. Another approach is to try to utilise the kind of organisational mandate that the centralised management group or leadership group have in an organisation. So perhaps the CEO or someone senior in the C-level kind of executive level of the organisation will use their organisational mandate to try to override some of the cultural problems with information management in the organisation. So it's kind of very much a top-down issuing of edicts about here's what we'll be doing from now on. We're going to build a data warehouse, for example. That might be one approach. Maybe we'll build and deploy a business intelligence system, or we'll deploy business analytics in our organisation. And you will use it because I'm the CEO and I'm telling you to do it. It can work because it's not just relying on technology. Very often technocratic utopianism goes hand in hand with this, but when it's done in a way that doesn't just depend upon technology but recognises the organisational issues involved, the human issues, the interrelationship issues involved in trying to change an organisational culture, it can work. So, as I said, for example, here at Monash, we're currently going through a process of centralised consolidation of information management, and we're seeing centralisation of finance functions and the IT support functions and things like that. And that's very much coming from a mandate from the sort of Vice-Chancellor or Deputy Vice-Chancellor level at the university. So they're using their organisational power to combat the kind of decentralised organisational power structures that have sprung up historically here at Monash. So when that is led by one particular person, such as the CEO, Davenport describes that as a kind of a monarchy, so the king or the emperor issuing an edict and all the little followers have to go along. And as I said, it can work, it can solve the problems. The real issue comes about when you get a change of guard. So the CEO leaves or the Vice-Chancellor leaves. I read ages ago now, so I'm not sure whether the statistic is still true or not, but the average tenure of a CEO is in the order of about 3 or 4 years. So if you deploy this kind of approach and it's the individual CEO using their organisational mandate to try and change things, what you find is that in 3 or 4 years' time, when they move on, their organisational mandate goes with them, and the information culture backslides back to kind of what it used to be before that person came around. So you need to think very carefully, or the CEO needs to think very carefully about what happens when they leave, to make sure that the changes get bedded down and don't slip back to the old sort of feudal kind of structure. So Davenport and his co-authors, Eccles and Prusak, recognised this as a problem, and they suggested that an alternative approach is not to use one single person's centralised authority or mandate, but rather you should adopt a more federalist kind of approach. So rather than using a king or an emperor to issue edicts, rather the senior leadership team within an organisation, so the centralised team, maybe the entire C-level group, maybe the heads of departments and so on, agree on a common approach to solving information cultural problems and managing information and governing information in an organisation. So they reckon it's the preferred model. It's really quite a difficult one to achieve because you're relying on not so much an individual to make decisions about how the information flow in an organisation should work, but rather a group of individuals, lots of different people, possibly with competing interests. So the kind of prevailing activity you see when this approach is used is one of negotiation, compromise. So one business unit wants to have information managed in a particular way, and maybe another unit wants it managed in a completely different way. You have to try and get consensus to make this kind of model actually work. So it really requires a culture of cooperation and learning, I guess. And that's really hard to achieve, particularly if someone, one or two people in that group, so one or two business unit leaders, feels threatened by that kind of approach because their information empire is being directly threatened. It's very easy to resist this kind of thing. Really needs a CIO or someone who's responsible for managing information in an organisation who's very politically astute, who can negotiate with the different leaders of different business units in an organisation to get them to some kind of agreement. Unfortunately, not a lot of IT people are trained to do that. That culture is changing a bit. The CIOs today are much more focused on the human side of information management and IT management than we used to have many years ago. So things are getting better from that perspective, but it's not an IT problem, it's an information management problem, it's a cultural problem, and you can't just deploy technology to fix it. So what do you do when you find yourself in an organisation and there's a problematic information culture? Well, the kind of Davenport's recommendation is, well, you should try and achieve this federalist kind of approach, but as I said, it's quite difficult to actually achieve in practice. One approach is to actually match the approach to managing information to the prevailing organisational culture. So, well, this is the culture we've got, let's work with that and design tools in such a way that they minimise any of the problems associated with a particular prevailing culture. So if people are wedded to doing their own kind of analysis in an anarchic kind of way, well, maybe we try and provide resources that are as good a quality as possible so that people can still do their own analysis and still provide their own decision support, but maybe we do something about trying to improve data quality. Maybe we try to come up with an easy way of ensuring that those spreadsheets are backed up somewhere, or we train people to design better spreadsheets so that they're more robust and more flexible, have fewer errors and so on. Or maybe if you've got a feudal kind of structure, well, maybe you have a centralised IT department, but you have strong representative groups in each of those different business units to try and design customised solutions for each of those different organisational units. So more of a data mart kind of approach rather than a centralised data warehousing approach. So really you have to be pragmatic, and the term that I particularly like is this idea of practising technological realism as opposed to technocratic utopianism. Be realistic about the role that technology can play. Technology is not going to solve human and cultural problems. It will certainly have an influence on those cultural problems and may exacerbate them, but it's not in and of itself going to solve those cultural problems. So be practical. Think of the prevailing information culture, and if you've got a culture of feudalism or anarchy, don't try to deploy, for example, an enterprise data warehouse, because it's just not going to work. You're going to get all this organisational resistance. So if you've got that kind of culture and you can't change it, choose one of the data mart type approaches, and you'll probably find that the independent data mart approach is the one that works best for highly decentralised, very strong, organisationally powerful business units. So choose the right kind of technology. Choose the right kind of people also to liaise and advocate for a more coherent kind of approach to information management, to try to solve some of those information problems. You have to keep in mind that for the individuals involved, the information problems at the enterprise level often aren't particularly apparent. So they need to be convinced of, why should I have to change my information practices to fix your problem? And often the argument needs to revolve around, well, you have better quality information, you'll be making better quality decisions. If we have a more coherent approach to ensuring that the information is reliable and the systems and structures you use to manage that information are more reliable, then if something goes wrong, we can fix it, we can help you to get back up and running much quicker. So you need the right kind of information politicians. Sending an engineer in who just says, right, we're going to build a data warehouse and you're going to use it, that's not only not particularly helpful, it may be quite antagonistic towards individuals, and you get that, that political kind of resistance. Try to avoid situations that encourage information empires to flourish. So encourage information sharing, encourage the kind of idea that information is a shared resource, it's not your personal property. So that's the ideal. In reality, very difficult to actually achieve. So not only do we have to practice technological realism, we have to be realistic about the kinds of information practices that are actually going to work in an organisation. So practice information realism as well. Okay, so keeping all of that in mind, the classic or orthodox idea of data warehousing that often comes from the vendors, this idea that build a data warehouse and you're going to solve all of your information management problems because everyone's going to have access to good quality, integrated, centralised information resources, just doesn't work. It's also the wrong problem to solve in many cases. And this paper is a classic of decision support systems or management information systems research, and was written in the era of management information systems being developed and failing, and very expensively so, because in the 1960s computers were incredibly expensive. There were, for example, here in Australia in the 1960s there was a total of, I think, about 16 computers in the entire country. So everyone had to share a computer and was very expensive. Everyone's covered the stuff in 5094 about management information systems of the 1960s and how they were not particularly good. Anyone who hasn't? Okay, good. So, Ackoff was Russell Ackoff was a management theorist, a management scientist, looking at why these IT systems designed to support managers failed. And he said they failed because they were based on, or designed based on the assumptions, a number of assumptions that are actually false. So the idea was that behind management information systems is that the problem people have with making good decisions is that they don't have the information that they need. There's this idea that more information is better than less information. There's this idea that managers don't have the information that they need, which in some cases is true, but in many cases is actually not true. It's not so much that they don't have the information they need, it's that they don't have the information in a way in which they can actually incorporate it into a decision-making process. So they perhaps don't understand the information, or the information is not presented to them in a structure that lends itself to being reused and incorporated into a decision-making structure. There's also this idea that you go and ask managers what information they need, and you design a system to get that information to them, and they're going to be happy. In many cases, that's not the case. Managers probably don't have a very good idea of what they actually need until they start using a system and exploring it. It's that classic problem of the requirements being influenced by the usage of the system, that Peter Keen stuff that we looked at way back in week 2. And finally, the systems were designed on this idea that you could build a reporting system and it would churn out information, and the managers wouldn't have to understand how the system worked to be able to actually use that information. Ackoff showed that all of those assumptions are false. And quite convincingly did so, and we saw the rise of the personal decision support systems in the 1970s as an antidote to the failures of the MIS systems. But if you look at the vendor literature in the 1990s and the 2000s around data warehousing, they make exactly these same assumptions again. And data warehouses failed for exactly the same reasons that the MIS systems in the 1960s failed. So whilst this paper was written nearly, 40 years ago, 44 years ago, in fact 44 years, we're still making those same false assumptions. The problems aren't around access to information, it's about using that information to make better decisions. That's not the same thing. So this kind of technocratic utopian view of building enterprise data warehouses and you're going to solve all of the information access problems and all of the information culture problems is just false. It's just not going to happen. Don't believe any vendor that tells you that that's the case. Data warehouses have a role to play, but we need to be realistic about what that role can be. Very often that's about reducing our expectations of what the technology is going to achieve and being realistic about improving the complex process that is decision making in organisations. Okay, that's a point to take a break. We'll come back, I think, in 5 minutes, and we'll talk about a couple of case studies. Has anyone got any questions about Davenport's model, information politics, information culture? The idea of matching culture to a technical architecture. So, for example, not using an enterprise warehouse approach for a decentralised kind of information culture, and being wary even of using an enterprise data warehouse approach for monarchic or feudal kind of structure, federal kind of structures as well. Yes?
About the centralized information or decentralized information, can you give an example? Example from monarchs?
Yes.
For example, IT faculty and education faculty, how they centralize information?
Okay, well, it's not information, it's information culture. Yeah, so keep that in mind. Up until very recently, we had, in fact, if I go back, say, 10 years ago, the Caulfield School of Information Technology didn't exist. We actually had a number of different departments based around different discipline groupings. So we had a Department of Information Systems, we had a Department of Computer Science and Software Engineering. In fact, we had Computer Science and we had Software Engineering. And about 7 or 8 years ago, they merged together. So we ended up with campus-based information, organisational structures. So the Caulfield School of IT, the Clayton School of IT, and so on. Back when we had a Department of Information Systems here at Caulfield, we had an IT department in that, an IT group in that department. And that group was responsible for managing all of the systems that we use information for. The information reporting generally went to the department head. And whilst the department head reported to a faculty dean and the faculty dean reported to a vice chancellor, the information flows up that hierarchy were fairly minimal. So most of the information management that the Department of Information Systems did was for its own internal management. So, you know, what lecturers do we have, what subjects are we running, what courses do we run, and things like that. 5, 6 years ago, we moved to this campus-based arrangement, and all of a sudden it's no longer just this smaller group of people working in information systems. We're now a campus-based group covering information systems, information management, librarianship and archives and record keeping came and joined us. So all of a sudden the organisational unit grew, and we moved from systems that were supporting a small group of people to systems supporting a larger group of people. So it was kind of a move from, and each of those different departments had their own kind of approach to managing information and reporting on information. They merged together and we had to get a more consistent approach at the campus level. We moved a lot of stuff to the faculty level as well. So we went from department to a school. From a school, a lot of the functions were moved to the faculty level, and then the faculty above that is the university level. So for the last 4 or 5 years now, we've had an IT group within the faculty of IT, and we've had our approach, and that's perhaps been different to the education faculty's approach. And over the last year or two, there's been a big push to try to centralise a lot of those functions now to the central Monash, the university level. So we have an IT services group at the central level. that's taking over a lot of the functions that used to be done originally 10 years ago by a small group of people in the department to the central level. So we now have systems and structures and organisational governance in place that sees a lot of reporting now going to the central level rather than the department head level. So there's now much more information flow going centrally, so that now we end up with situations where, for example, you all fill out unit evaluation reports at the end of semester. That's done centrally. It's not a different individual faculty thing. Used to be back when we were a department, we'd have our own approach to kind of getting feedback about how courses were running and so on. Now there's a much more consistent approach right across the university to doing that. So that's one example. Reporting on, say, research quality and things like that is now becoming a much more centralised function. So there's this shift now to information requirements being moved to the central level rather than the departmental level. So everything's becoming more centralised. And as a result, the information culture is becoming more centralised too. So because the information requirements for the Faculty of IT are now very similar to the information requirements for the Faculty of Education, there's similar kind of solutions, similar kinds of approaches to managing information across those faculties, whereas historically that wasn't the case. But that's Monash. Other organisations have a decentralised. There tends to be those sort of swings and pendulums. For a while, maybe 10 years or so, there might be a push towards centralising things, and then might swing back again. And over the next following 10 years, there's a push to decentralise things. And organisations tend to swing between centralised or decentralised over time. So I reckon in about 10 years' time, we'll start seeing again individual small groups of IT support, for example, coming back. It used to be, but it's not so much now. Yeah, so it's becoming more centralised. Yeah, but that's just the IT department, but that's happening for lots of different business functions as well. So finance, for example, we had a couple of accountants here at the Caulfield School of IT. One of those accountants is now going to the central administration finance function because the operational side of things is moving now to a more centralised kind of approach. Thanks. Sorry, Dario. Yep.
So basically the difference between
Sorry.
The difference between federalism and feudalism is that decisions, I mean, they are both two decentralized systems, but
not really. The feudal structure is decentralised. So each of the organisational units has their own approach. It's kind of like the Caulfield School of IT having its approach to managing information, and the Clayton School of IT doing their own thing. The feudal federal structure is where there's a consistent approach right across the organisation. So what we do here at Caulfield is the same as what they do at Clayton and so on, but the organisational mandate to get that happening occurs because of agreement between, say, the different faculty deans. So there's a consistent approach, but it's come about because of agreement between the different unit heads. So that contrasts with the monarchy approach, where the mandate comes from one single leader, like a CEO, or say here at Monash, the Vice Chancellor, for example.
So it's just a more democratic approach?
Kind of, but not necessarily democratic in the true sense of the word. It's more a collegiate approach, maybe. That's a better way of describing it. But it depends upon cooperation and negotiation and a common vision that gets deployed across the organisation from a group of people rather than just one single person.
Actually, what you say from there is that we need to match the IT procedures into the organizational culture. But is it
not just IT procedures. So I know I keep talking about IT, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's one step away from IT, but information management. Really.
But is it happening in the other way around, changing the organizational structure to match the system?
That's often what people try to do. So they'll say, right, we've got an anarchic approach to information, an anarchic information culture in our organisation. We need to fix it because that leads to situations where there's lack of consistency. We can't get data from one part of the organisation and compare it to data from the other part of the organisation because the assumptions are different levels of data quality, the same terms used, but it means completely different things. So we're going to fix it by, we're going to have a better information culture. Let's build a data warehouse and people are going to use it and we'll change things from the top down. If it's just a technical approach, it's open to failure. The likelihood of it working is very small. If it's a combination of technology and organisational, cultural changes, as you get with a sort of monarchy approach, it can work because it's recognising that it's not a technical problem, it's a social problem. But even then, it's hard. Changing culture is a really hard thing to do. Introducing change in general in an organisation is hard to do, but when you're addressing political issues, power-based issues, the motive for individuals to resist, and they've got the power, so they are not just individuals, they're deploying their political power to resist the project or the change. It becomes really hard to achieve. So in some cases, you simply have to sit back and say, well, we can't change the culture. We need to work with the culture that we've got and try to solve the problems that culture creates. So it's about being realistic. Sure, it's not about abandoning change altogether, but being realistic about what change can be achieved. And maybe you have to adopt an incremental approach to change rather than saying, okay, we're not doing this anymore, we're going to do this. That may not work. Let's try small changes, and over time the culture will hopefully change for the better.
I think, Robin, in an IT company, it's even more difficult. I mean, I know my company and our company, we've got business consultants and we've got, networking consultants, we've got developers, and and they're all sort of quite separate, and all have a different approach to knowledge, and we get quite a bit of clashing and stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
What's the right way of doing it?
And it's always our way is the right way.
So it becomes even more complex, I think, in an IT company.
Yeah, and so the only way you can overcome those kinds of perceptions is by having a very savvy politician, and not professional politician, but someone who understands the politics and doesn't say, okay, we're going to change this because it's good in and of itself, but convincing people that they need to change themselves. So it's kind of a bottom-up kind of thing rather than a top-down kind of approach. Sure.
This process of centralized, for example, information, it has some negatives.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Because one thing is, centralized things will have the same indicators for the whole organization.
Yeah, that's right. It's assuming that your information needs are the same as your information needs, and
are going to lose some?
Yes, yeah. What you lose is the individualised, tailored support.
In the case of Monash?
Well, yeah, that happens too. For example, with the IT function moving to a centralised, the IT services group out at Clayton, means I can't just pop down to the guys on level 6 and say, I need a new network cable. I've got to send off an email or use a web-based request form, and someone will get to it in a couple of hours' time, and maybe in 2 weeks' time I'll get my network cable. So yeah, you lose something in the quality of the service because the people providing that service are further away from where that's happening. And that's why you get these pendulum swings in organisations. Right, we need to solve our decentralised information problem because it's a mess, no one knows how the organisation works, so we'll bring everything together, then we can much more easily manage that process. And then everyone out in the fringes of the organisation starts to complain and say, well, we don't get the support we used to anymore, so you start to swing back to a more decentralised approach. And it just keeps going backwards and forwards all the time. So a purely highly centralised approach isn't perfect, a highly decentralised approach isn't perfect, even a hybrid approach isn't perfect. They've got their own caveats and downsides. Okay, well, I said we were going to take a break, so let's take a break. 5 minutes, we'll come back and we'll have a look at some case studies. Ilya, how are you?
Yeah, all right.
You look all right.
I was actually, the reason why I was in Fulbright.
No, Fulbright.
Well, it does. Well, actually, I can't figure out what it does. But it came with a set up suit virtual machine, and try to set it up.
And you got something.
Yeah, it doesn't really work as I planned.
Yeah, I know the feeling. It's the problem with open source stuff. And, I mean, once you get it up and running, it's rock solid. But
To get there
is so hard.
They don't have a lot of useful makers. Like, hey, let's try out open source BI. Here's the menu.
No, it's self-documenting. Why do you need to?
Well, self-document means that you have to spend billion years just to get there.
Yeah.
And then
Config files. Oh, anyway.
no, it's just the problem is that it's not that I assume it's sort of prepackaged, it's sort of pre-configured.
It'd be like a install, bang, done.
Yeah, no.
No. I had the same problem with Joomla actually last week.
Yeah, well, there's only one thing you need to do.
No, there was a few things I had to do.
Well, the installation process is relatively.
Assuming there's no bugs. There was a bug in the previous version of Joomla.
Okay.
So yeah, and so you set up MySQL, get that up and running, make sure you got permission set up, and that's a whole thing in and of itself.
Yeah, but this is fairly intuitive. I mean, I've done it once, but it was.
It's intuitive if you're used to open source type projects. So if you're comfortable with config file, particularly setting up say PHP and Apache, MySQL's a bit quite easy. Well, yeah, but this was on a Mac, so it was kind of there, but I had to configure it. So you got to log in, create a user, change the password, because you don't want root with a blank password as a public-facing website. Configuring PHP, so making sure that the error reporting levels are right and that certain modules are turned on, because Joomla expects certain modules in PHP to be turned on, and knowing how to do that is.
I actually haven't done it once.
I've done it dozens of times now, and it's still frustrating. And this is on a Mac, so it's supposed to it's meant to just work. So at least there's kind of GUIs to go through most of it. And then I installed Joomla, and it had a bug that. No, we've got a Mac Mini server that's running OS X server upstairs, and we're running a web server and a podcast server on it. And we'll run blog servers and things like that. Yeah. Oh, because it's easy to manage. We've all got Macs, and being able to remotely manage it from. No, it's like if I was trying to do this on a Windows server, it'd be an extra level of difficulty on top of that, because you got to get the Microsoft tools to run on the Mac and remote desktop and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
About assignment
Sure.
converting time. I haven't started assignment yet.
Okay.
So maybe this week. Do you have any conversion time this week?
I do, but post lots of questions to the discussion forum. That's where most of the information is going to be shared. Yeah.
So it's that in Google.
Yeah. So and you should have already got stuff sent to you via email. As people post stuff to Moodle, it gets sent out via email. So this is why email filters are a useful thing. So set up a folder and but post questions there, because you'll find that some of your questions will already be answered on the forum, and B, if I answer your question on the forum, then other people get the benefits of it as well. And well, I'm more than happy to meet face to face. It's just getting me physically can be hard sometimes. So compared to Pod, exactly. Yeah, I'm very available.
9 to 5.
Yeah, but compared to email and Moodle, cool.
Why did function for the accounting is not it would be like so much easier to see what benefits what.
It is really.
Yeah, but it doesn't have evidence to include them, so you can understand how to do that.
It's, well, yeah, okay, the list of attributes is on the separate thing, but that's what you find when you go into an organisation, you look at the systems documentation they've got, they're all developed by different people, so they've all got their own modelling style. And you're lucky that there's a diagram at all. It's, you know, in many cases, you just got to literally open up the database and look inside it and see what's there. It's actually, there's a lot of, this term, red herring, there's a lot of misinterpretation in our case. So it's about sorting out what's needed and what's not needed. Yeah, that's right. So what I'm trying to do is weed out those people who have that binary approach. They look at the diagram and go, right, okay, all this is the database. That's not the approach to use. What you've got to do is analyse the case, work out what they need from a decision making design solutions. Yeah. Sorry? Am I starting? Oh, yes, I'm starting. Yeah. Okay, switch myself on. Okay. Hi, everyone. Let's get back underway. So what we've been looking at is the idea of information culture and information politics, and how that can interact with a kind of approach to data warehousing that may produce some negative effects instead of the desired positive effects. So matching your data warehousing approach to the prevailing organisational culture is quite important. So all of that is a long way of saying that you can't just take a cookie cutter approach to data warehousing. So you know how often it seems to be always Dario that asks the question, and my answer is always, well, it depends. This is why it depends. There is no one solution. You always have to take into account the idiosyncrasies of each individual case. So to drive that home, I'm going to talk through a couple of different case studies, just very quickly, not delving into a lot of detail, just to compare one project to another and see that success in a data warehousing project isn't dependent on any one particular technical factor. It's about understanding the decision-making requirements and trying to focus on those rather than sort of data management requirements. So we're going to look at three different projects, two different types. We'll look at two very large-scale projects and one unusual small-scale project. The large-scale projects are more traditional kinds of data warehousing projects. So the first one's in a financial carried out at a financial institution. Their approach was to adopt a data mart approach rather than an enterprise data warehouse approach. And they were using an off-the-shelf BI tool. From memory, it was Cognos. It was a few years ago now, so I keep getting Cognos and Business Object mixed up, but I'm pretty sure it was a Cognos deployment. So it was one of the large banks, one of the 4 big banks. And they sourced their data from an enterprise data warehouse and operational system. So it was kind of a hybrid dependent data mart, independent data mart kind of approach. And this often pops up. So even when organisations decide to do a dependent data mart approach where you've got a centralised enterprise data warehouse that provides the data for other more customised data marts, when you're developing a data mart, you often find, oh, there's a particular piece of data that's not in the data warehouse. We need to get it from another source system or maybe an external system altogether. So you end up without this kind of pure dependent data mart approach, and you end up with this kind of hybrid structure, which in some cases in some ways defeats the purpose of doing a dependent data mart approach. But anyway, that's what they were grappling with from a technical perspective. They did a lot of pre-planning as well, so they put together a business case and tried to come up with an estimate on return on investment. They expected payback roughly in 2 years' time, based on a $1 to $5 million cost for the project. But whilst that's a good thing, very often data warehousing projects don't engage in that kind of pre-planning business case process to the extent of calculating what the return on investment will be over time. These guys did it, but they never actually measured it. So they did the planning beforehand and estimated how much they were going to profit from the project, but after the project never actually got around to seeing whether they achieved that aim or not. And that's really quite common. One of the characteristics of this particular case study is a common theme across data warehousing projects. It took a lot longer than they expected it to take. They were expecting about 6 months or so, and it ended up taking them 18 months to develop the system. And we see this time and again, really significantly underestimating the time involved. And really the major hurdle was that they didn't realise how complex the data sourcing was going to be. So they tried to jump in without really thinking about without really understanding how the source data fit together. So no one on the team really understood the source systems and where it was coming from. The project was a success though, so it wasn't. They didn't consider it a failure. It just cost a lot more and took a lot longer to develop than they thought. So 3 times longer, in fact. The development process was in-house. So there was a business analyst who was championing the project. Some staff from the IT department were seconded to the project and were kind of engaged in a pseudo consulting engagement to build the system. And they got some external consultants from the vendor to come in and do some training and a little bit of development work. And that worked quite well. So it was a good mixture of external expertise from the vendor who really understood the tool and internal IT expertise that understood the systems, even though they didn't really understand the data that was in those systems. And that was the major hurdle that had to be overcome. Another interesting thing interesting thing they did that works well in a lot of data warehousing or BI projects was that they had approximately a small number of users, approximately 10 or so to start with. And their approach to training and deployment was that they would train those 10 individual users on a one-on-one basis. So they wouldn't put them in a room, projector, everyone's behind a computer screen. There'd be individualised training for each of those people. Then each of those people would go back to their business unit and train other users. So it's kind of the idea of training the trainer. You train one person up to use the system, they start using it, and they become kind of the expert in that tool in their organisational unit, and other people in that unit go to them to find out how to do the tool, how to use the tool. And that worked really, really well. So they ended up with a sort of personalised training plus people going out and training other people and growing the user base that way. So this idea of not understanding the source data being a real hurdle, data management becoming a real problem and causing delay to the project is a common theme. And this kind of approach to training and knowledge sharing by having a hybrid development team are things which we see quite often in data warehousing cases. Those things actually work quite well. Okay, so one of the key issues, and again we see this across lots of case studies as well, is that the data warehousing team were kind of outside of the normal structure of the IT department and how IT was managed in the organisation. And whilst that created a certain level of autonomy for the data warehousing team, they could kind of jump in commando style and fix up or design the system without the sort of problems that you get with the bureaucratic process of trying to design a system. The problem was more from a career perspective. If you're part of that team, there's no clear progression up to, through the organisational hierarchy to be promoted. But if you're in that team, there's a team leader, and that was it. So as a result, after a couple of years of the data warehouse running, the original members of the team were no longer at the organisation. They left for better career prospects. And that's a common problem for BI and data warehousing in general, particularly when it's a project-based thing. So a lot of organisations now are looking to treat data warehouse not as an IT project as such, but as IT infrastructure. So dealing with the data warehouse developers and managers in the same way that you deal with ERP developers and system maintainers. So they're a normalised part of the IT department. There's a clear sort of career progression, and the knowledge tends to reside more in the organisation. It also means that the team's not continuously putting together business cases for the next round of funding for the data warehouse. Now, in terms of sort of technical features of the project, they ran their ETL process on a monthly basis. So they did a complete refresh because of the difficulty of doing the change data capture stuff in the ETL process. and they were archiving the detail off for anything that was older than 1 month. They'd aggregate the data and archive the detail. So they had different levels of granularity for different time periods of data. This was a few years ago, so it was a big data warehouse at the time. It's now quite small by comparison, about 20 to 50 gigabytes worth of data. These days we'd be talking 20 to 50 terabytes worth of data. But 50 tables or so, which is not a particularly large, complex data model when you compare to transaction processing database schemas. And one of the big benefits they got out of it was an improvement to data quality. So the problem that caused the delay in the project, not really understanding the nature of the data in the source systems, became the main benefit at the other end of the project, because the main problem was data quality. So they spent a lot of time fixing data quality, incorporating routines into the ETL process to fix up data quality as it's coming into the data warehouse, utilising those routines to push back better quality data back to the source systems as well, so what we call back flushing the data, so that not only the data warehouse users get better quality data, but the transaction processing system users get better quality data too. They quoted a standard, they came up with an organisational standard for data quality of 5% tolerance. Now what that exactly means, no one's entirely sure, because data quality is it's not really a quantitative thing. We're going to look at next week, I think next week, we're going to look at the idea of data quality. And it's not just about having correct data, but it's about having the right data for the right purpose, for the right people, in the right time frame. And there's a lot of non-quantitative aspects to that. So the idea of 5% tolerance, I think, just related to the number of records that could be said to be correct. So it was at a row level rather than sort of an attribute level. But they wanted 95% data quality as their kind of stated aim, and they actually managed to get that in the end based on how they measured that. So, like I said, very high-level view. Their approach was a data mart kind of approach. A few hassles along the way, but some of those lessons that came out are quite common. Not particularly massive data warehouse. It was a data mart, of course. But still some common problems there. Now keep those in mind as we look at the next project. So again, this is a large-scale project, but this is in a government department. So the previous one was one of the big four banks. I can't say which one, but it's one of the big four ones here in Australia. This is a very large federal government department, and it was a particular business unit in that department that needed better quality data. They were trying to improve a particular business process. They saw the data warehouse as a way of achieving that. So they had half a terabyte worth of data. This is 1999, I think. No, 2001. This project was deployed. It was actually one of our PhD students back at the time who was the lead consultant for it. So 500 gigabytes worth of data, 50 million records, and 1,000 tables. So contrast that to the previous case study that had 50 tables and 10% the size of the data. So these guys were dealing with a lot more transactional data than the previous project was, and the nature of the decision support that was being provided by the data warehouse meant that they had to have that transaction level data to do their job. The most astounding thing for this case study, from my perspective, is that the vendor determined the budget. And the way that came about was that the vendor, for a long time, there was one particular consultant for the vendor, or sales consultant for the vendor, had been working on this federal government department for a good 2 years or so, trying to convince them to purchase their data warehousing technology and to deploy it. And finally, he got to the point where he convinced them that they should buy their product. He was making a final presentation to the department secretary and the sort of the next level down group of people. So essentially the kind of what would be in a private sector, the board of directors, making the pitch, and he convinced them that they needed to purchase this data warehouse, or the data warehouse technology, and they asked the question, well, how much is it going to cost us? He sat back and did a few calculations in his head. He said, $10 million. And they went, yep, excellent, we'll do it. The way he calculated that $10 million was that he was calculating the commission that he would get from the sale and the fact that he wanted to take 6 months off and the amount of money he needed to charter a yacht to sail around the Mediterranean. So literally, I spoke to him, and that's the calculation he used to come up with the $10 million figure. Nothing at all to do with the actual cost of the technology. So it's just astounding. And he did. He took 6 months off and he went sailing around the Mediterranean. Just astounding. Anyway, so $10 million, and the system was deployed and it worked. The delivery of the system was originally, the delivery system, the front end that the end users actually used, was originally straight SQL. So there wasn't a BI tool at all. It was targeted towards a particular group of power users. So SQL was kind of appropriate for this situation because of the skill set of the users actually working with the data. The nature of the department, this federal government department, it deals a lot with money, which kind of gives away which department that is. And this particular group was particularly focused on fraud. I'm going to say it was the tax department. I shouldn't be naming the case study, but it was the tax department. And the group of users was people investigating tax fraud. So being able to identify patterns in people's tax returns and claims and target likely fraudulent tax submissions to make sure that they paid the right amount of tax. So no formal data quality procedures, which is astounding considering it's the tax department. So the group of users was in the order of 200 to 350 users, and it was one-on-one training for all of those users. And they had the freedom to actually do whatever they liked to the data warehouse structure. So the users could get in, roll up their sleeves, create tables, drop tables, do whatever they liked, and do all sorts of analysis and so on. So the flexibility for the end users was maximised to the fullest extent, because the entire warehouse was dropped after a month and the refresh recreated the data warehouse. So the ETL process was a complete refresh, and the users understood that any tables that they created themselves and any sort of analysis and data that they did inside the database would be lost the next time the ETL process was run. So that was okay. But there was no constraints on the users at all from a data management perspective. Initially, they got some assistance from the vendor to design their data warehouse, but that shifted to an internal data warehousing team that reported directly to the national CIO. And the requirements gathering process was basically sitting around looking at existing reports and saying, well, how do we replicate this with the data warehouse? They used an enterprise-wide approach, so it was an enterprise ER model. That's the preferred approach of the vendor, was an enterprise-wide approach. It suited their technology and their software. And over time, the developers, the users developed basically their own delivery systems. So they started using GQL, Power Builder, and Visual Basic to write their own applications. Essentially, what they were doing was extensive data mining, so looking for patterns in the data, but handcrafting their own data mining tools to do that. The outcome of the project was absolutely astoundingly successful. They managed to increase revenue by 20 to 30% in some areas, and we're talking the federal tax department, so 20 to 30% of the federal government budget is pretty significant. We're talking multi-million dollars at the time, probably billions of dollars these days. So the project more than paid for the $10 million fee that set the consultant sailing around the Mediterranean. At the time, they didn't have much in the way of a delivery system other than sort of homegrown things that the users developed themselves. But at the time that I wrote these slides, which was a couple of years ago now, so about 3 or 4 years ago, they were looking at the idea of introducing some OLAP reporting, so deploying a BI tool to do some of that sort of OLAP style slice and dice analysis. The problem with using, or the reason they want to introduce OLAP in a more centralised kind of way with a BI system is that because the users had so much freedom on the data warehouse to create their own tables and create their own sort of summary data and so on, they've got cubes or these small data structures that are basically star schemas all through the data warehouse that get dropped, and they've moved to having virtual cubes on everyone's servers. So people have been using sort of Excel pivot tables and things like that. So they've got these temporary multi-dimensional structures all over the place. So they're trying to consolidate that, or they were trying to consolidate that a couple of years ago through the use of a BI tool. So, very, very different style of project. Large-scale enterprise data warehouse project compared to the previous project. Both were dealing with largely financial information, but very different approaches. Data mart versus enterprise data warehouse. Both used sort of internal teams. One had a very good business case put together. Another was figures based on a calculation in the head of a consultant. Basically, the consultant dictated the budget. But both user groups for both projects are really, really pleased with the outcome of the project. So an outstanding success in both cases. Now, to a very, very different case. This is a very small case. I'm going to do a very brief version of this because it's also used by David in 5094. So if you're doing DSS, or sorry, IT for management decision making, you'll get a more detailed version of this case study. But this is a case study that one of our master's students was the main player in. So he was a master's student here at Monash, finished his degree and then went and worked for the family company. So he was an Italian, he was Australian, but his family was Italian. So he moved to Italy to join the company, basically run the IT department for that company, which consisted of about 5 people. So a very small IT department. The company is Campagnolo. They're a clothing wholesaler and manufacturer. I think based in Milan. Have you heard of these guys at all?
It's close to Milan. It's more close to my home.
Yeah, so you know the company then? Yeah. So they manufacture all sorts of leisure wear and tracksuits and things like that. And I think lingerie, they've got a line of lingerie as well, I think, and that kind of thing. Perhaps under a different brand, but yeah, that becomes important in a second. So it's a large manufacturing company, family owned, and he went off to run their IT department. The IT infrastructure in the organisation was really old, so we're talking about 7 or 8 years ago, and they were running a mainframe system, I think, with COBOL that had been designed in the 1980s, using a customised database, so they couldn't get data out of the system. They had to use the mainframe software itself to produce reports and so on. So it wasn't a relational database and those kinds of things. IT was viewed by the company as a cost rather than a sort of strategic benefit to the organisation. So the organisation wasn't really thinking strategically about IT. IT was there purely to manage, do transaction processing. Oh, sorry, it was databases were in Informix, so it was a relational database, but it was really hard to get the data out. What they wanted to do, what our student had done was he'd studied DSS, he'd studied data warehousing, and was sort of enthused about using IT for supporting decision making in the organisation. And one of the problems that the organisation had was answering customer queries and getting information out to customers. So they had a call centre where people could call the equivalent of a 1-800 number, so reverse charge call, and ask about order details, and a lot of the queries were to do with what products were available and how long it was going to take for their order to be fulfilled. So very basic customer questions. The customers, of course, because this is a wholesale company, the customers are retailers, and a lot of their customers were located in the Middle East. So Middle East, fairly conservative countries, and one of the big problems they had was sending out their catalogue to their customers in the Middle East, because what would happen was that certain sections of the catalogue would have their lingerie line, for example, and the censor, when it arrives via post, would open up the post and look at the catalogue and go, you can't have that page, you can't have that page. And so what they actually, for a while, what they were doing was they were sending out electronic catalogues through the post. So they put it on a CD, and to get it past the censor, what they would do was label it as a music CD, and the first couple of tracks of the CD would be music, and then the last track would be a PDF file that would contain, so get around it that way. So they had a call centre to allow their customers to call in and place orders and things like that, and they were getting lots of queries at the call centre about very basic order information. So the call centre operators would take the call, jump onto the OLTP system and do a query and say, oh, well, your order shipped yesterday, it should arrive in about 3 weeks' time, that kind of thing. So what our student decided to do was to try to solve some of those basic problems around the information being in the transaction processing system, and open it up for not just the call centre operators, but for management also, to get a better picture of what was happening in the organisation. And of course, the reverse charge phone calls were quite expensive. So reverse charge means that Campagnolo was paying for the phone call, not the customer. And those customers were in the Middle East, so we're paying international calling rates and things like that. So it was quite an expense for them. So the first thing that was done by the IT department was to try to open up the database system. So what they did was they moved to a new database management system, and they turned on the replication function of that DBMS. So basically, they created a copy of the transaction data, and the size was roughly 12 gigabytes or so of transactional data, and then they ran some reporting tools on the replica server. So they didn't do any kind of exotic ETL, they just simply turned on replication on the DBMS. Does everyone know what I mean by replication? Yep. Basically it's copy. And it just keeps it in sync. So when a new record gets added or changed in the original system, the DBMS flows that change through to the other replica. So essentially what they did was created an enterprise data warehouse by turning on replication, and that was the ETL process. SIDF, that's the Italian acronym for the IT department. So what it meant was that they could do some basic reporting on that copy of the data and provide a intuitive, easy to understand user interface to managers and call centre operators to answer some of those common queries. And that meant the IT department staff could focus on the more complex kinds of queries and reports that were sometimes coming through from management. So the users themselves could handle a lot of the basic reporting functionality using the new sort of OLAP tool and the data warehouse. And the IT department could then focus on the really tricky things, the tricky queries and reports. So it was initially very, very successful. This was their initial system. So transaction processing system, users, basically terminals connected to a mainframe system, and then a replica of the relational database being provided to run a BI tool. In this case, it was Brio, because that's what they had available. It ran on a Mac, and that was kind of important because there was a mixture of Macs versus PCs in the organisation. So all of a sudden we had management now getting access to data that they didn't have access to before, which was kind of, not so much they didn't have access to, but they could provide their own decision support. And it freed up the IT department to do some of the trickier things. And it also meant that so freed up the IT people to do some thinking about how you could restructure that database to more efficiently, more flexibly provide decision support to the managers. So very simple reports were happening now, but our former master's student had learned all about star schemas and designing data marts by doing this unit, and thought, well, maybe we can restructure that transactional data to make it even more user-friendly so that managers can provide even more of their own decision support using the OLAP tool. So that's what he did. They designed a star schema, and they got some an external firm to come in and design the schema itself. But they used a warehouse workbench, a data warehousing DBMS DBMS tool to do the ETL process. So it wasn't just replication; it was a proper ETL process mapping onto a star schema. So, as that was happening, the problem of the call centre receiving all of these international phone calls and paying for them was identified as a problem. And they decided to actually build a website. So instead of sending out the CDs with the music tracks and the hidden PDF file, they decided, well, let's just build a web server and then people can connect to the web server themselves. We don't have to worry about sending the catalogue out. Customers can place orders via the website, and things will get streamlined quite a bit. But all of those calls that were coming into the call centre, they weren't just placing orders, they were often queries about the orders as well. So at the same time that the IT department was thinking about improving reporting for management, it was noticed that, well, maybe we can, or the idea occurred to them that maybe we can reduce the cost of this 1-800 number by allowing the customers to do some of their own reporting too. So instead of calling up and relying on the telephone operator to run a report, let's open up the database and make it available via the website. So that's what they did. They linked the data warehouse to the web server. Brio had a web-based client as well as a desktop client that could be used, and so they basically made that an extranet, if you like. So customers could log on, they were given a password, and they could run some of their own reports. So this is what we ended up with. This is the final data warehousing structure. You can see the original transaction processing system up there. Now the database server there was a proper ETL process feeding into a separate data mart, star schema-based server. And there was a mixture of internal clients and external clients using the BI tool. The internal clients used the desktop version of the software. The external clients used the web-based version. And everyone was deliriously happy. Call center costs fell through the floor. Customers got better service. They got better access to the information that they wanted. Management had better access to the kinds of reports that they wanted. And the IT department was freed up to focus on those really tricky problems that that you needed IT expertise to solve, rather than continuously trying to run basic reports to satisfy management decision support needs. All of this occurred in a period of about 3 days. So small-scale project, the kinds of benefits they got from it, though, are equivalent to the kinds of benefits that the large-scale projects delivered. Obviously not in a financial sense, but in terms of success, the users were deliriously happy, gave a significant reduction in the cost of the call centre, and it was a massive, outstanding success. And all of it was really almost by accident. So our former master student, the IT manager, was simply tinkering really with the database to see what it could do. Got some software, toyed around with that to see what it could do. And the reason he noticed or thought about the 1-800 number customer request was because he was a red-blooded single male Italian, and most of the call centre operators were single female Italians, and he liked to take his lunch by sitting down and talking with them. And it was that led him to the idea of creating the web-based BI tool. So the response is that the company was deliriously happy with it. They started to view IT not so much as an expense or a cost centre, but as something that could be used strategically to do things better in the organisation. And they're continuing to evolve the system over time. So they're actually growing it. So whilst the initial development was in the order of 3 days, they're still building it, developing it, making it work for them in a better way. So it's it's been a couple of years now that the system has been continuing to grow. Okay, so that's Campagnolo. So what we've seen are 3 very, very different cases. 2 very large scale cases, 1 very small scale case. Across the 3 different cases, very different approaches to technology philosophy, so enterprise versus data mart approach, very evolutionary approaches versus less evolutionary, more traditional kind of linear development approaches. Users who at one stage were using SQL to do their own delivery system development versus very sophisticated BI tools being used for the end users. And all of them were successful case studies. So you can't sit down and say, well, here's the technical things that you must do to make sure the project works, because there are none. There is no one right answer. You've got to do what you've got to do to get the project to work. The common theme that led to success across all of the projects is not so much technical, but it's the fact that they focused on improving decision making and decision support for the end users. And it's that leads to success. It's that focus that leads to success. Doesn't mean that you can ignore the data management issues, and certainly the tax department, the financial institution case study, data management and data quality were a big problem for them that they had to solve. But the success of the project was in improving decision making and decision support. So, to conclude, organisational issues are a real killer. Technology issues, whilst they can be quite time consuming, this is not rocket science. Building big databases is not hard to do. Relational database management systems are mature technologies. Running a terabyte data warehouse is not a problem. I've got a 3 terabyte hard drive at home, for example. It's not hard to get that much data. And it's not too much harder to actually manage that data effectively either. The technology is well known, it's well understood. What's really hard are the organisational issues. The reasons why data warehousing projects fail is usually not to do with the technology. It's usually to do with organisational issues like information politics, focusing on data management rather than decision-making processes. And a variety of different approaches can work in terms of managing the project, eliciting requirements, and solving those technical problems. So I guess the lesson that I'm trying to impart is that there's no one-size-fits-all kind of approach. And that's the reason why so many of the answers that I provide in this class are, it depends, because it does. Okay, so that's kind of it for this week. Are there any questions that you guys have got about the case studies? As I said, the Campagnola case is going to be dealt with in a bit more detail in David's unit, so you can get more information there. I think he's assigning one of the papers from that case for you to read as well. So. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I'll let you go. I'll see you all next week, and I'll see my guys in about 15 minutes or so. See you guys. Rocket science, yeah, it really isn't. Like, I could quite easily deploy, say, SQL Server on a Windows server and manage multi-gigabytes worth of data without changing any of the configuration settings. Terabyte data DBMS with hundreds of users. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you might need to tweak a few things, but it's not hard to do. Millions of users and tens of terabytes, that's tricky to do. But data warehouses, terabytes worth of size, maybe 10, 15 users, it's not hard.
Oh, thank you very much, Tar.
Can I get some help with the assignment in the tutorial class? So I've just got a few questions and a bit unsure about a few things.
Have you been reading and posting to the discussion forum?
No.
Okay, I'd suggest doing that. Not to say I'm not going to talk to you about it, but it's important to use that resource as well.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the questions you've probably got possibly already been dealt with.
They sort of seem silly and like obvious, but not obvious. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's no such thing as a silly question. So a lot of the questions posted in the discussion forum, for example, are very basic sort of questions. So feel free to post them.
It's got more to do with like the business processes and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah. Well, look, if it's stuff about details of the case, do it as a discussion forum post. It'll be much easier, much better for everyone to see that.
Yeah, I just want to know if I've got the business processes right.
Yep.
That's all it is. I mean, you can say yeah or no.
Okay.
That's what I mean. Like, it's not something that you put up on discussion because, like, why would you discuss something that's either yes or no? Because
if you don't understand the business process, or if you're not sure about the business process, chances are lots of people are unsure about it too.
But they haven't even started it, like they said.
Some haven't started. There's already been a fair bit of discussion on the forum already, so there's a good number of people who have tackled it. But just because they haven't started it doesn't mean that they won't have those questions as well.
Because I've got a fair few business processes, but that doesn't sound right.
Well, it might be that your focus is wrong. So keep in mind that a data warehouse isn't about managing a business process. It's about supporting decision requirements. Yeah, look, if the questions are about decision requirements rather than processes, even if they are, I still think it's you'll get. Sorry, it's not the benefit kind of adheres to everyone. So by posting it to the discussion forum, everyone gets to get clarification on that. It also means that what I tell you then is consistent with what I tell someone else because I remember what so yeah, happy to have a chat, but as much as possible, put stuff onto the discussion forum, even if you think it's a silly question. It's yeah. Howdy.
Way more fun.